Alright class, welcome back to the Wandering Cantos. Today we're going to be taking a look at a literary study of Kiki's delivery service. So, a bit about the film. Kiki's delivery service was released on July 29th, 1989. However, it just got a 4K IMAX remaster, so go check it out in theaters if you can. I was able to see it in theaters, and it was really cool getting to actually get to see this on the big screen, so I highly recommend it. So this one was created by Studio Ghibli and was written, produced, and directed by Hayao Miyazaki. However, it's based on a novel by Iko Kanano. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. That being said, though, today we're going to be focusing on the film and the film's plot for our overall discussion. So, just wanted to give a quick spoiler warning. Everything beyond this point will be getting into spoiler territory. So, that being said, let's take a look at a plot summary. So, Kiki's delivery service follows a young witch named Kiki as she leaves her home and sets out on a quaint coming-of-age adventure. Rather than some grand fantasy epic, though, the story follows Kiki as she arrives in a new town and starts a small business delivering packages for the city's residents. While she does this work, however, she meets a bunch of interesting characters and basically forms a sort of found family. These friends include Osano, a bakery shop owner, Fuko, a baker, Ursula, an artist, Madame and Dora, who are sweet elderly clients, and Tombo, a young aviation enthusiast. The main crisis to this plot comes when Kiki begins to become burned out with her work and loses her magical abilities. However, after a forced retreat with Ursula, she's able to use her powers again when she sees that her friend Tombo needs saving. So, let's look at the characters and sort of what roles they play. So we have Kiki, who is the main protagonist of the story. We have Gigi, who is a black cat and Kiki's magical familiar. He ends up sort of representing childhood in a way. There's Ursula, an artist who serves as the main source of wisdom and guidance for Kiki. And then there's Osano and Fuko, who are married bakers who serve a sort of motherly, fatherly role to Kiki. And then there's the Madame and Dora, and these are elderly clients of Kiki who ultimately sort of act sort of like grandmotherly figures to Kiki. And there's Tombo, a young aviation enthusiast who befriends Kiki and serves sort of as a romantic interest, and also in a way a bit of an antagonist, but we'll get into that later. So, antagonist. This plot doesn't really have a clear personified antagonist, which is not a bad thing. Tons of stories don't. But, there isn't a dark Sith Lord who is, antagonizing Kiki throughout the plot. I would argue that the crows, time as a concept, and weather all serve as minor antagonists, since these are usually the things that are interrupting her delivery services or causing her to be late to the aviation party that she really wanted to go to, and things like that. However, interestingly enough, I think that Kiki sort of serves as an antagonist to herself at times, as she tries to process her own thoughts, feelings, and emotions with growing up. Because she is shy and at times prideful, she has a hard time opening up to Tombo and his friends in the aviation club, which causes her a great deal of stress. And this stress seems to be directly related to her loss of magic. Ultimately, I think at times Kiki isn't able to be fully honest with herself, and I don't think that's always intentional. I think as part of growing up, you sometimes experience these sort of thoughts and emotions, and you're not totally sure what they mean or what they really are, and so it's sort of trying to, find meaning in that as one of the main sort of struggles. And so as she tries to find meaning and sort of understand why she feels certain ways, it's also technically herself who's getting in the way of her coming to those realizations. And while Ursula's pep talk to Kiki focuses on avoiding burnout through finding your own voice and inspiration, I do think it's important to acknowledge that Kiki's interactions with Tombo seem to also be directly tied to her loss of magic. So, our main themes and ideas. So the first one is sort of just growing up, coming of age, and a loss of innocence. This story is ultimately about a coming of age. While it isn't as dark as some loss of innocence stories, I do think Kiki's inability to understand Gigi hints at some degree of outgrowing the imaginative innocence of childhood, so there is some loss of innocence in that. And then there's sort of a theme of artists and burnout, and also sort of taking your passions and making them work, and then to get a profit, and how that can actually lead to burnout. So, by taking her passion, which is magic and flying, and turning it into a job, Kiki begins to lose some of her love for that passion and begins to suffer from burnout. The cure to burnout, according to Ursula and the story, is really focusing on your voice and what you want to say. And then we have the importance of community. So Kiki isn't able to make it in the city alone. When she first shows up and she has no connections, she's really struggling. She almost gets arrested. She can't even find a place to really peacefully eat lunch. So she needs a community. And while she's open to some connections early on, for example, Ursula and Osano, she learns ultimately that she needs to also be open to friendships with others her age, like Tombo and the Aviation Club. So I want to cover some criticisms I have for this movie, but I do want to emphasize that these criticisms shouldn't be taken as me saying the movie is bad. I wouldn't lower my review score of the movie based on these criticisms, but from a literary perspective, when we're really trying to analyze theme and, we've got our red pens out and we're trying to analyze it, I think some of these need to at least be acknowledged. So, Kiki's loss of magic doesn't seem to be fully explored. So, Kiki's loss of magic seems to be directly related to her outing with Tombo and her feelings surrounding him. Before that, she has no problems with any magic. Up to that morning, she can still hear Gigi before she leaves for the work assignment that ultimately is her delivering cookies to Tombo, and then they end up having an outing. So she had no magical issues and really no burnout at that point. And I do think that's really important to emphasize. She sort of has her, mopey day in when she gets sick and misses out on the party, but that doesn't actually affect her magic. So then she loses her magic and she ends up going on a little retreat with Ursula. And Ursula's advice and the themes around her advice seem to be more focused on burnout. Ursula says that she once struggled to make art, but then she realized that she was just imitating others. And she tells Kiki that it's important for her to find her own voice and her own sort of inspiration, that real thing in your heart that, helps you connect to your passion. And while I love this theme and, this part of the movie, I love the whole retreat to the forest where they're all kind of snugged up in the cabin. And as an artist myself, I relate to these themes a lot. I think it's still sort of disconnected from Kiki's issue with growing up and being honest with herself and understanding her emotions. Because I almost felt like when she tells Ursula that she's worried that she's been working too much and that's why she's lost her magical ability, I kind of felt like that was still her sort of covering up also to herself, that it may be more connected to her sort of emotions and feelings towards Tombo. I think basically she might be having a mix of sort of jealousy when he goes to talk to his other friends, and also she thinks his friends are bullies since one of the girls was really mean to the madam and her sort of baked good, and she thinks they're sort of snobbish and she's poor in her dress and doesn't have a lot of money and these kids seem rich. There's all this sort of this cocktail of emotions, and I think it's basically really the answer that since she's not in alignment with those emotions, and those emotions are also, chaotic and disorganized, and it's sort of like clutter inside her mind. I think that's what's actually impacting her magic. But she tells Ursula that it's about burnout, so then we get this long scene about her trying to overcome burnout rather than overcoming her sort of mixed up emotions with Tombo. And then she leaves Ursula's and sees that Tombo is in danger, so then she's able to save him. But it didn't feel like the reason her broom worked in the end was because she recovered from burnout, and it wasn't that she was so burned out on flying, but then she was able to find the passion for flying via her passion for wanting to save Tombo. Like, the motivation of Tombo didn't make her basically pick her pencil up again, pick her paintbrush up again, if you will. So I felt like that whole thing got kind of messy, and it sort of had, there was two separate issues, and only one was addressed, but the real one that seemed to matter more didn't really fully get addressed. So I just feel like at the end, if you're really trying to annotate it and get down to the theme and stuff, it gets a little messy. Now, this next one's going to be kind of controversial, but I feel like Asano and Fuko's, I hope I'm pronouncing the name correctly, but the role in the story is sort of weird. So that being said, I need to, emphasize that they might just be my favorite characters in the whole story. So this is not me criticizing their characters. I love them. They make me laugh the most, make me feel the most warmth in the movie. They're wonderful. However, purely from like a literary analysis and a sort of, analyzing the actual story structure and kind of the skeleton of the story, they sort of serve a weird role in it. So Kiki has loving parents who support her and who she can learn from. Like, her mom is a witch. So it seems strange that she, gets/needs this motherly, fatherly figure and role models on her adventure. Usually this type of character only exists in stories where the protagonist either doesn't have parental figures or their parental figures are bad. It's like Luke Skywalker loses his parental figures, so then he gets kind of Obi-Wan Kenobi for a bit, and then sort of Yoda in a way. And I kind of hate to quote it, but like with Harry Potter, he has, really bad step parents. So then when he goes to Hogwarts and he has these nice professors who sort of act kind of fatherly or motherly to him, that role like clicks into the story because they're basically filling a void that wasn't there before. So, by the end of the story, you don't want Kiki to leave Osano, since that feels like that's her home now, which is ultimately weird considering that she has this wonderful mother at home. And while I get that there's something to be said about the fact that, if you go out on a coming-of-age adventure, and also she is still a child, so it's not weird in that sense that she would, if she was a real person, it doesn't seem weird that she would seek out maybe like a sort of alternative mother role. But from a story perspective and in terms of analyzing Kiki's growth, it feels weird that it's like, in order for her to grow, she has to leave home so she isn't under the shadow of her parents. But then she goes and finds 2 new parents and lives at home with them and does chores for them and works for them, because it doesn't seem like her parents are against her having independence or learning magic, since they obviously heavily co-sign her going on this grand adventure, and it's a tradition in being a witch. So it just feels a little weird in that way. But again, I love them, so I'm not saying, oh, they should be cut from the story, but I think it's, it's worth acknowledging that it's a bit weird when you think about this as a story about Kiki kind of growing up and becoming independent. And then we have our final one, which is Gigi's magic doesn't return. So this one has never really sat right with me. So first of all, from like a world building perspective, it doesn't really make sense. Kiki regains her magic, so she should be able to hear Gigi again, and Gigi should be able to understand her again. Also, her surprise at learning that Gigi can't hear her reveals that it is like an uncommon thing for witches to lose the ability to speak to their familiars at a certain age. In fact, when she realizes that she can't understand Gigi and Gigi can't understand her, that's what makes her realize she's lost her magic, and then she, bolts up and tries out her broom to see if she can still fly, and that's what ultimately confirms it. So basically, like, this ending makes it feel like Gigi was an imaginary friend that Kiki outgrew, because usually in coming of age stories, the protagonist might bittersweetly lose contact with their imaginary friend. It would be like Calvin and Hobbes if one day Calvin can't hear Hobbes anymore, or like Winnie the Pooh. It's a big thing that Christopher Robin eventually leaves the 100-acre woods and can't like communicate with Winnie the Pooh and all the other animals that he can normally speak with. So it feels like the story treats Gigi like he's like a Winnie the Pooh figure, but Kiki actually is a witch who can use magic. It isn't imagination. And then, like, furthermore, it just doesn't feel like it's a plot point that was like, it just basically feels like it's a plot point that wasn't fully wrapped up. So since the story ends with Kiki still having her magic, this isn't like a Peter Pan story, it feels like a random bittersweet point that doesn't tonally fit the ending. Kind of felt like they just needed something kind of sad and a little bittersweet to be like, well, coming of age is bittersweet. But it just doesn't seem like it fits this one. Usually, in a coming of age story where there is sort of that bittersweetness, it usually has, maybe two brothers who are growing up in a stressful environment will get into a fist fight, and their friendship and brotherhoodness never fully like reconnects after that. And while they might now have a new understanding of each other as being young men or men, they're never able to fully go back to how things were, because now that they've become men, they're not these little boys who need each other fully 100%. Or again, like with the 100-acre woods thing, you kind of need Christopher Robin to do that to grow up. But it would be weird if Christopher Robin could still speak to some of the imaginary figures but couldn't the rest. So like, it's weird that Kiki can still fly her broom and have magic in that sense, but can't speak to Gigi. Because essentially it begs the question, like, why does Kiki have to lose the ability to communicate with Gigi in order to grow up, but doesn't have to lose her magic? It's not like, oh, in this family bloodline, witches have magic until they turn 13 and then they become, normal humans. It's not like a Narnia thing or something. Because it's not like Gigi was always guiding her and controlling her decisions. That would make more sense if it was like, Kiki had never made a decision, on her own before. Gigi always was, team captain, but now that Kiki has grown up, she can't hear Gigi. That would make sense, but really, Gigi just makes some sarcastic remarks that Kiki almost always just disregards, and then she makes her own decision anyway. And this is from the beginning of the story before they even leave on their great adventure. So, I don't know why it's important that she loses her, friend in Gigi. That's enough of criticisms for now. So my final thoughts, basically, I really love this movie, and I think it might just be my favorite Ghibli movie. That being said, the first time I saw it, I felt like the ending was super rushed. And while it felt less rushed on a second watch when I knew what to expect, it still feels like some of the themes and ideas and conflicts aren't fully developed and addressed. Because again, we have her being very conflicted about Tombo, and then at the end she saves Tombo, but it comes after a whole speech again about burnout rather than a speech about being honest with one's emotions or figuring out a way to understand their own heart or something like that. And then again, the Gigi thing is kind of weird because I was expecting some resolution to that, because it also almost weirdly feels like, because Gigi falls in love with that white cat, he might weirdly have like some blame for why the communication breaks down, but that's sort of a weird theme if you think about it. So yeah, I feel like it was a bit rushed, but ultimately I still really liked it. And I will say, I'm really glad that there weren't any scenes of like social cringe where Kiki like horribly messed up a delivery or something like that, because I kept waiting for that to happen. It almost felt like a Chekhov's gun where it was like, oh, she's gonna like really mess up one of these deliveries and then have to deal with, you know, the consequences of that as part of growing up. But they didn't really have that, which I really appreciate. The worst was just when she was late for the party, but that ultimately gets resolved pretty quickly since Osano kind of communicates on behalf of Kiki to Tombo, and Tombo's like super understanding. So it keeps the whole movie feeling really cozy and safe, and it's kind of one of the reasons why it's one of my favorites. So yeah, I think that's going to sort of wrap up this little literary study. I mostly just kind of wanted to discuss the themes, sort of the roles of the characters, and also sort of point out my criticisms and how those sort of relate directly to the more like literary side of the story. So if you enjoyed this episode, please consider subscribing and giving the video a like. I'd also just like to hear in the comments if you liked this, if you like this type of content and want to see more of it. I had a lot of fun with this one. It's a bit different from my normal content, but I'd like to make more. And I'd like to hear from you in general. What are your thoughts on this film? Did you, agree with my criticisms? Did you disagree? And if so, why? Let me know in the comments. It's one of my favorite parts is posting these videos and then actually having people to discuss these movies with, because I've just been living with these thoughts by myself. So I'd love to hear your thoughts. I try to respond to everything. But with that being said, I think I'm going to wrap this one up. So take care, and I will see you in the next one.